First of all, thank you everyone for attending to this event. So I'm Miguel. I'm going to start this presentation. So as you can see, it's similarity-based cognition, radical activism meets cognitive neuroscience. First, okay, I want to start introducing the idea of similarity-based cognition. So the idea that this kind of cognition occurs when an agent explores relation of similarity holding between two or more items in order to perform some cognitive tasks. So the most canonical examples of these ideas, for example, when we use a cartographic map to navigate the city towards a certain location, or when we use the column or a mercury thermometer to make judgments about the temperature of the room, right? So this basically in this idea, in this kind of cognition, an item X, the map or the thermometer, is used or is taken as a surrogate or standing for the item Y, sorry, either the city or the room, the temperature of the room, to make reliable judgments, inferences, or decide on courses of action. So far, this idea is pretty straightforward. The interesting aspect is that similarity-based cognition is attracting a lot of attention from cognitive neuroscience. So many cognitive neuroscientists think that we can explain a lot of cognitive activities through this kind of this variety of cognitions, this kind of cognition. So the interesting aspect we need to note before we jump to the second section is that what we need to discuss what kind of similarities we are talking here, right? So when we talk about similarity-based cognition at the neural level, we are talking about structure-preserving mapping relations, so what they have been called structural similarities or second-order resemblances. So the idea is that neural items, they can be states, assemblies, or processes, they causally contribute to achieve some cognitive tasks in virtue of mirroring relevant structural features of a distal target domain. Okay? Again, there's a canonical, the most canonical example in the neuroscience literature is the role of place cells and grid cells in spatial navigations in rodents. So the idea is here that there are a series of neurons in the hippocampus of rats that fire when the rat is in a particular location or when the rat is facing to a particular location, what is called the place field. So the idea is that the pattern of co-activation relationships between neurons, so broadly their tendency to show joint activity, resemble or is structurally similar to the structure of the spatial layout of the place field. Okay, so we kind of have, and we will discuss later, some kind of map here. So place cells seem to play an essential role in rats' navigation skill, though I have to say that most evidence is indirect because it's based on experiments done with rats with lesions in their hippocampus, and they have appreciated that they have difficulties in navigating the maze. Okay? So now, the interesting aspect of similarity-based cognition or neurally based similarity-based cognition is that according to many people, it justifies a new idea or a new conception of what mental or cognitive representations are. So for example, we have a couple of quotes here. The first one is from William Ramsey that tells us that structural representation or S-representations are an essential part of cognitive neuroscience, and they hold a considerable promise as an explanatory posit. In the same way, or similar vein, Piccinini tells us that there is an emerging consensus that the best way to understand representation in the context of cognitive explanation is structural. So it seems that the structural representation, the idea that the brain represents by mirroring structural features of some target domain, is gaining a lot of attention. But the first aspect we need to note here is that according to the literature, the canonical literature in philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognitive science, is that for something to be a representation, it needs to answer what is called the job description challenge, what was called by Ramsey the job description challenge. So it's basically the idea that for anything to be a representation, first it must have inherent content, so it must to refer to something else in a way that it can is satisfactory condition. Yes, they have satisfaction condition of a special sort, like it can be true or false, right or wrong, etc. And this content or these contentful properties cannot be derived from external attributions. So the neural state must have those contentful properties inherently, or content must not be derived. This is the idea, right? The second one is that it has to play a causal role in guiding cognitive behavior in virtue of this content. Okay? So this is something that many authors have expressed, the idea that the content of those representations must play a causal role, otherwise we are not having a representation. That's a classical critique, for example, against symbolic cognition or classical computationalism, is that symbols play a role in virtue of their syntactic properties, but not in virtue of their content. So why are we justified to think that they have content and therefore that they are representations? So the idea here is that many people are defending that F representations are interesting because they can answer the job description challenge. So for example, O'Brien tells us that representing vehicles of F representations are contentful in virtue of resembling the represented objects. So the content in this case, unlike the case for of symbols, for example, is that there is no gap between vehicle and content. So the same properties that make the vehicle structurally similar to the target domain are the properties that are contentful in this case. So the argument here is, okay, if F representations play a specific causal role in guiding the behavior of a system in virtue of the structural properties, and if those structural properties are inherently contentful, that's the idea of O'Brien, then the contentful properties of F representation are causally potent. So F representations have exactly the kind of ingredients or elements that symbolic representation didn't have. So we solved, apparently, we met the requirements of the job description challenge. So this is the idea. So that's why F representations are attracting so much attention. So now, Dan?
Okay, so I'll take over and for a short bit, and well, see how short it is, and make the case against S representations. I mean, we're not going to challenge any of those properties other than the question of whether or not they actually deliver an account of content per se. So if you, and everyone knows literature, and we're not going to spend much time on this, though people may want to come back to this in questions. One of the standard things that people have focused on in the literature is to give responses to the indeterminacy objection, to say that, look, if these S representations have content and it is granted to them in virtue of their structural similarities, the properties, their mapping properties, then the worry has always been that those properties might be indeterminate because they're going to be structurally similar to too many possible things, too many possible targets. So either they are about or referring or otherwise representing all of those items, in the example of maps being possibly representing poorly or otherwise another city than the one that they actually can operate for. So we don't seem to have any way to contain that. Now that's usually where people have come up with a number of different proposals, etiological accounts, causal embeddedness, etc. Those might cross-cut some of the positions I want to look at anyway in a moment. But in any case, I don't want to spend a lot of time looking at the indeterminacy objection as it's responded to here. What we think is important for us to do is to get to what the essence of the hard problem, the challenge that we really want to pose, and the subtleties around that. So for us, the really tough questions come up here. We want to ask whether the existence of structural similarities on their own suffice for one state of affairs to specify something about another state of affairs. Or to put that slightly differently, do structural similarities on their own refer, describe, or depict target state of affairs in ways that can be said to be inherently true or false, accurate or inaccurate, veridical or non-veridical, and so on for other forms of representational satisfaction conditions. And of course, and this will be the touchy point, I'm sure, in the discussions, it's going to boil down to what we think of this notion of being inherently so, because obviously we can describe them so, and that's going to be the biggest question for us, why we should take those descriptions seriously at the level of the nature of the states themselves. So if we look at it, this of course is the sufficiency claim given one by Piccinini. When a system's internal states satisfy the conditions for being an S representation, they qualify as representations in a robust sense which possess semantic content by the light of a naturalistic theory of semantic content. Now, we don't have any doubt, and we mentioned this in the paper, that structural similarities might be said to ground content in the sense of enabling content and valuations and inferences. That's uncontroversial, I should think. But the question we want to raise is or the concern we want to raise is that fact doesn't follow from that at all, that the structural similarities suffice for content, those that you might use to make judgments. So the grounding notion here might be that we can use these to make all sorts of inferences, contentful and other contentful inferences, but that doesn't mean we're giving expression to a content that is existing in the state of affairs themselves. Now, what is the motivation for worrying about whether they have any kind of content at all? Why should we be concerned? Of course, there's this idea is old, and it's the thought for many different authors that there are these well-known analyses that reveal that similarities and resemblances in and of themselves are neither necessary or sufficient for content. If we think of these, there are some form of covariance relations. When we boil that down to put all the niceties out of it, that's what the issue is. And if covariance itself isn't any kind of content, which many people acknowledge, then just those covariances alone shouldn't give us reason to think that we have content in these cases. So let me give an example of a kind of grounding case that might be revealing, because we think these are a basis for, but not sufficient for content. So if you look at a geologist's tale, we have here something like this. It's a quote from Gibson, not JJ, another Gibson. Consider a rock formation from which some piece of geological history can be reconstructed, perhaps a stratified formation with a layer of coal above a layer of limestone, so some physical structures there in the world that have formed. Now, the author says the coal is the remains of the ancient forest and may be said to represent here, in quotes, a forest. The limestone is the deposit of an ancient sea, and it represents the sea. Now, I find this interesting just from the point of view of what we're doing in this bit of philosophical work, whereas in the first, we do see here very much an attributional case. It may be said to represent, with it represented in scare quotes. It's just as easy to write that sentence without the scare quotes and without the attribution. The limestone deposit of an ancient sea, it simply represents the sea. But for us, really, the core debate is somewhere between these two. Which of these readings should we take more seriously? But the whole formation does not just represent or list two things, the forest and the sea. Rather, the fact that the coal stratum sits above the limestone, that spatial relation represents it as being the case that the sea came before the forest. So what we have encoded, or people would talk about encoded, we would resist that kind of language, as we'll come back to so later. But what we have here is a relationship holding between natural phenomena, forms of covariation, which we can now say something about precisely because we have the concepts to talk about them in these terms and say true things on the basis of this. So this is what we mean by there are covariances. We have no difficulty at all with the thought that with the right conceptual equipment, you can make all sorts of contentful claims and inferences based on these structures. Bringing us over into neuroscience, this again wasn't in the written paper, but just to kind of draw out the point in a slightly different way for the presentation. Some authors have been concerned that there hasn't been enough consideration in cognitive neuroscience as to how or whether the potential information might actually be decoded by a receiver. And here the worry is that, let's back that up. Here the question would be, what could it actually mean in this case to decode information in the relevant sense? One way of decoding was the example I just gave you, where you have the relevant background concepts and we have structures that in themselves are not contentful, but we use them to make inferences. Now you might think that there is, that's all that's going on, but even if the brain was doing that, it would have to receive covariational information and use it in this kind of way. So the ability, as they put it, quote, to decode as an external observer does not mean that we have identified the code by which the brain represents information, and here the question is if it represents information at all. So the assumption there that we want to challenge is whether or not the brain needs to represent information in this way at all. And I think that what these authors were pointing out is that information in neuroscience is often measured with an implicit experimenter as receiver assumption, rather than thinking in terms of the cortex as a receiver, and then asking questions about what information would cortex need in order to do its job or perform its functions. We had a lot more to say. We've cut a few slides on this for now, but we can pick them up in questions if need be. Now, with all that in mind, returning to the earlier question, if we think that structural similarities, like all similarities, just aren't necessary or sufficient for content, if we concern ourselves with that, then you might think we do need to find an additional reason or different apparatus to explain how these structural similarities get their content. And a lot of authors will want to combine that story with something like the semantic account. And I want to focus on this because I still think this is the go-to solution in literature, and I think it is, as these authors point out, Thompson and Piccinini, the best developed and most plausible theory of representational content. So I would agree with that, and I think maybe Miguel too. The question, though, is it good enough and does it work? And we have questions about whether it delivers a theory of content as opposed to delivering something just a little bit short of that, which is a theory of targeted intentionality. So, of course, everyone, I hope, is familiar with these debates. And here's Millikan reminding us that some of us have argued that we should ground the needed norms to give us an account of content in evolutionary biology, and many, many have followed in our footprints since then. Many different versions of this project. But in the original formulation, teleosemantics aimed to, as McGinn puts it, turn theology into truth conditions. We will focus on truth conditions because of Millikan here, but we could just, if anyone was really interested, I don't think anything significant about what we have to say will vary if we switch to other forms of representational satisfaction conditions such as accuracy or otherwise. But that's, again, something somebody might wish to challenge or bring up in the discussion. So, reminding you what Millikan's story there was, is what makes, she's using her canonical example of bee dances, what makes the dances into representations is not what they do, but why they work. So it's that understanding their functions in that wider sense. Why they help cause the arrival at sites of nectar, and hence the arrival of nectar in the hive, and hence well-fed larval bees. And they do that work by bearing a correspondence to what they represent. If we switch this over, this is our slight modification, but it turns out to be important, we could say they do that work by bearing a correspondence to what they target, without representing it contentfully at all. And I think you don't lose any explanatory power here, but you move away from a kind of other puzzling mystery. So why is that intentionality? Millikan tells us, well, because the dances display the characteristic trait of the intentional. Namely, they can be wrong or false. And then she adds, should anything disturb the normal mapping between the shape of the dance and the location of the nectar, this misalignment will quite literally lead the workers astray. I want to pause over that for a moment because we're going to draw back on it. We want to keep the second or third sentence on that slide. We totally agree that the normal mappings will cause all sorts of misalignments that will lead to whether successful actions or not with respect to some needs of the organisms in question, but we don't think that that entails the system is representing in ways that make it wrong or false. And that is almost the essence of the critique or the challenge against the sufficiency claim that we want to make. So whereas Millikan wants to say the bee dance have truth conditions, we want to drop that claim on the grounds that we don't know what it is that is being specified such that it would be correct or incorrect, although we want to retain the notion that it is in fact targeting certain things rather than other things. So we think there can be a determinacy of target to some extent based on an evaluation of the biological background, but we don't think content comes into it in the way that Millikan is suggesting here. So let me also highlight for our audience what we think, where we think that those issues really come to, the rubber hits the road. So in her recent book, Karen Neander tells us something only counts as a mental representation if it is used to represent a target as being a certain way that it might or might not be. And she adds, if a mental representation represents it all, it represents something in one way and not in innumerable other possible ways. So we all know our Frege, so going to this, she highlights that, well, look, if that's the condition, then it would send up a red flag if the relevant content descriptions were not intentional with an S. So she would think that if we making content descriptions that weren't intentional in S, they really just don't qualify as representations in the sense in which she thinks we have a robust sense of a representation. And I take it that's what the debate pivots on, and that those in it, such as Piccini and others, are trying to provide us with this robust notion of representation. It's certainly what we're challenging. So we think that you can get by with something less than that. Motivating this in the teleosemantic literature is, of course, the famous indeterminacy problem. And what we have is just too many possible higher-level content descriptions that could be equally capture simultaneously what it is that the system the content of the semantic content of a creature's response or a neural assembly. So in the case of the frog's visual motion detector, fly or moving black dot could both be simultaneously acceptable descriptions of the signal semantic content and many others. And again, we know this through the literature has been repeated many times. So on that basis, it seems that no amount of environmental appropriateness of a neural state or its effects is fine-grained enough to give a unique propositional content to the neural state, but I don't think softening the notion to a different form of content other than proposition, if we can make sense of what that would be, is going to get around this worry about indeterminacy. There have been valiant attempts to do this. In the 90s, the target selection arguments were meant to take us a long way. Arguments there were to determine what is being targeted by means of a counterfactual analysis. So which of these would have been selected for, as opposed to having been merely selected. We then would use that selection for as a way of picking out the very properties that would enable us to ascribe content to the state itself with some accuracy, with some determinate function. But which of these should we pick? For example, attempts were made to show that perhaps the target ought to be thought of as food, not black dots, not flies, flies, not black dots, not food, black dots, not flies, not food. But the ultimate problem, as probably all of us are familiar with this in literature, is that all of these things on different levels work for different explanations that are all part of a larger account. So different sciences would give different answers of what it is that the frog systems need to be targeting, and we don't have a singular notion that we want to describe as the content of the frog's visual system. So we keep running into that indeterminacy at different levels. I think Good and Griffiths do a good job in helping to push this along when they conclude that these levels are complementary, not competing. So really, in the end, we might move away from the canonical disjunction problem and think that really what we want is some form of conjunctive content. So accordingly, if you really want to describe a content of the frog's state of mind, it would be some inclusive list of the following: small, dark, and moving, nutritious, fitness-enhancing, fly. Now this is, I think, where things are important. We come to, I think, a choice point. One could take that kind of composite list to capture the intentional with an S content of the state of the frog's perceptual system, or maybe you think of the S representation that's part of this, if you wanted to connect those two stories. But now you have a content that is seemingly attributed, that is both odd in its formation, but also we have the option to simply resist this invitation altogether, to make no such ascription. Nothing actually, I think, is lost explanatorily, nor are we obliged to do this if we assume that the list picks out the state of affairs that the frog was targeting in extension, and perhaps doing so, again, by a similarity-based structure. So if we think of it in this way, we can say that the things that determine what it is are fixed by the evolutionary history of the system in its normal environment, but it lacks anything like intentional with an S content. We don't need to ascribe that to the system at all. Now, and just to note this, which is a peculiarity, Millikan herself in recent times has come out against Neander, saying that she doesn't think these, her push-me-pull-you representations, the intentional icons that are in discussion here, have intentional with an S property. So if she's right, on her own account, they violate this very property that we're arguing they lack. I don't think that she's retracted the idea that they have truth conditions, That's interesting because it raises different questions how that could be the case. I think precisely that they don't have truth conditions if they lack intentional with an S content. So we would want to agree with Millikan on that, but we would want to push further to say that that's the very reason to doubt that they have any kind of content at all. And of course, our assessment of this isn't unique. And this comes up from many authors who think this, and for a long time. So the story for many has been Millikan just doesn't provide an adequate theory of content. The technical apparatus she provides does define a relation that can hold between a system's mental state and properties sometimes instantiated in the environment, and we fully agree with that. But we do agree with Petrovsky when he says, look, the relation here so defined is not as its content that. Rather, it shows what targets in extension in the environment the system has responded to that's made a good enough contribution to its cognitive perpetuation of its cognitive systems. Okay, let's just shift now very quickly. We didn't give a detailed argument in the paper, but we did gesture it. New work by Johnny Lee that was an interesting paper in Mind and Language in 2018. So Lee holded that existing S representational accounts have only touched upon the issue of how to think about content. And well, we certainly agree that the baseline ones need some need further augmentation to deliver a theory for themselves. And Lee aims to show how in detail how we can provide the naturalistic understanding of content that dispels the strongest accusations of the anti-representationalists, which I guess that's us. He points to the distinction between non-natural information bearers being distinct from natural information bearers, and that both potentially are decoupled from the conditions, in that the first is potentially decouplable from the conditions it bears information about, and the condition it bears information about there may be false. And so this gives it more of the property of a full-fledged representation. And that actually would be meeting a challenge that we raised, Eric Mayen and I raised long ago in our book, Radicalizing and Activism. We said, if you can come up with a different account other than covariation that's scientifically respectable, and you can give us the details of that theory, then you should be able to answer the challenge that we laid down back then. And Lee tells us that this is both intuitively, implicitly within the practice of cognitive science. Non-natural information remains informative in the appropriate sense that distinguishes it from the mere covariate relations. But Lee also admits at a certain point that, at least to date, we have no adequate theory which justifies the presence of non-natural information. Yet recognizing the centrality of it to explanations in cognitive science, he thinks that justifies, or thinks that gives us reason to be skeptical about the hard problem of content and the challenge it lays down, because it seems to be a useful notion in the cognitive sciences. So just to say, that is what we used to call in our first book the don't have, you admit you don't have the theory, but you want to persuade us that we should keep the notion, isn't really to give us the full-fledged account that we would want to see in order to be convinced if we're skeptics. But the real puzzle then becomes, actually, do we in fact need this? We would accept that establishing the need might make us, or make people wary to relinquish the notions when they don't have the account, but we would still think as philosophers we want to push to get the full account until we were persuaded. And we would also want to be sure that we don't need to go the other way in these debates and simply reject the notion in favor of a contentless one, if it's at all possible to do so. And I think that's where the debates really become tricky. So Lee puts it this way: if one's theory of a system of S representation has a feedback component, then the system is going to adjust its behavior on a mismatch between an S representation and some feature of a task. Then this mismatch, right, provides further justification for thinking that error, therefore accuracy conditions, and therefore content arise. And that contributes to our understanding of how the mechanism works. Of course, we think that, if you had full-on representational error, then you would get these properties of accuracy conditions, truth conditions, and therefore content. But we will dial back and say, you can get a notion of misalignment and targeting. It doesn't involve error in that sense, and therefore break this connection between the representational satisfaction conditions, and therefore break the link between that and content. And so we will continue to try to see if that's possible. In the very sketchy example we gave in the book, but we think that's actually useful in some respects because we just want to break the tendency, the intuitive tendency to think that we need to read these descriptions in terms of content. Would be to say that you can imagine a system like a set of keys that meets resistance and is a sort of a pattern, established pattern of behavior, which is to circle through the different possible keys until one of them hits a lock. And so the feedback mechanism would just be the resistance. And you can imagine a purely mechanical device working in this way that makes no representation of the situation for itself, that specifies these things in contentful terms. So we don't think that, even though there may be complicated systems with feedback, and we certainly think that's true in cognition, we don't think that gives us sufficient reason to believe that we need to have a representational system content, and especially so when we think at the moment we lack an adequate theory of content. So a kind of general thought that's come up in recent literature is we have to always be aware, and of course this is the subtleties in the philosophy, that we can explain or describe things propositionally and do so contentfully, and without those things ultimately being propositional or contentful in nature. And that's really the substance of our challenge to the sufficiency claim for this section. Right, I'm going to turn over to Miguel now, who will bring us home, and we only have two short sections left.
Yes, so now the thing here is that someone could think that, okay, if the challenge of radical activists is strike true, maybe it's not that devastating. Maybe, as I say here, maybe it's not a problem, it's an opportunity. It's something that is an idea that is gestured by Glaciowski and Milkowski. My apologies if I not pronounce it well. It's like, well, perhaps representationalists should treat the arguments from anti-representationalists as an opportunity to develop, strengthen, and indeed reform the mainstream understanding of what representations are. So we say that the mainstream understanding is based on the idea that has content, and content implies satisfaction conditions such as being right or wrong, true or false, etc. So it seems that a possible option here is say, well, maybe we don't need content. Maybe we can talk about cognitive representations without, leaving aside these kind of assumptions that some people think that are properly that comes from analytic philosophers. This is, for example, the point that Jacobson made many times in a paper from 2015. It's like, actually, she's asking, well, is content that important after all? And she responds, well, the notion of content is not really employed in cognitive in neuroscience to any significant extent. And it isn't needed. It isn't needed by other disciplines involved in cognitive science. So the notion of content, she tells us, is not, well, it's a philosophical invention. And actually, the interesting aspect here is that she connects this with the theories of representational similarity that we are here discussing. And she says, with the rise of representational similarity and the elaboration of what representations in neuroscience amounts to, there seems no doubt now that cognitive neuroscientists have in mind a very different notion of representation. And she continues, cognitive neuroscience is not employing contentful representations. So the question we are asking here is that, okay, can we get any justification to think that structural similarities in the brain are representations even if they have no content? And there are some proposals in the literature. So the main idea here is that, okay, let's not forget the content, let's focus on the function that this structural similarity is playing. And a quote from Ramsey said, well, if we think of mental representations as something more like elements of maps, models, or simulations, then we can at least get the outlines of, I like to how Ramsey placed it very carefully, at least get the outlines of a story about how a part of the brain could actually function in a representational manner. Okay, I have this nice London map of Sherlock Holmes. And the idea here, they connect this discussion with the place cells again. He tells us what, insofar as these neural transformations implement a coordinate geometry during navigation that reflects the structure of the items and properties of the environment, it is perfectly natural and, more importantly, explanatory beneficial to regard such a system as functioning as a map. System, he means the place cells and the grid cells. A specific element of the system are thus functioning as representations of features of a target domain. So the idea here is that, well, forget the content. If you have something that is working as a map, or is map-like if you want, then we can talk about representations in a significant way. The same is gestured by Glaciowski and Milkowski. Hippocampal spatial maps in rat have been proposed as a good example of an internal S representation. The rat's hippocampus is thought to implement an internal map of the spatial layout of the environment encoded in a Cartesian coordinate system. The thing is, the Cartesian coordinate system has been disputed by some others, as Bechtel, for example, and Nick Shea both doubt. But the important thing is, okay, let's come back to the idea that the pattern of coactivation relationship mirror the structure of the layout. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is the triviality problem. That anything can be map-like or model-like. So being map-like or model-like is trivial. Again, so we use these toy examples in the paper and say, well, actually humans are protozoa-like if you want, because we have cells. So this like is very, very trivial. So the argument here that we want to make is, well, the way we use maps and models constitute canonical examples of non-mental representation in real life. This is an idea that Ramsey introduced in his representation of reconciliation. So again, the way we use maps and models is what makes them non-mental representations. So if neurally based structural similarities can be shown to be exploited by cognitive systems in a way that is analogous to the way we exploit maps and models in real life, then it seems that we have strong reasons to think that they play a representational role in cognition. Okay? So, for example, we are looking for something like that. So in the end, we are looking for something like a GPS system and the console pin of GPS system. So the pivotal question is not if place cells are map-like, but if there is anything like map consulting in this case. So does the map reading analogy hold in any robust sense when we talk about the brain? And I have to say that there are philosophers that doubt this. For example, Gottfried Smith tells us that it is natural from the scientist's point of view to say that the rat is using X, the neural structure of the place cells, as a guide to Y, the environment or the maze. But as far as the mechanics of the situation are concerned, the as guide to Y claim seems extraneous. So Gottfried Smith is like, well, it seems like a nice metaphorical way to talk, but when you go to the details, you don't really, doesn't look like that we have those elements. He relies on a paper from Stallman and Ray in the 90s. Basically, they try to replicate, so they're interested not in how the place cells are formed and how the place cells are used in navigating. And then the conclusion of Stallman and Ray is that actually you can get pretty much intelligent behavior in terms of navigation with some neurons, a very simple neural system, like well-wired and everything. So in the end, they tell you what, the joint activation of the place cells elicit a motor response in the rat. But there is no further mechanism that reads the map in a significant way. So they tell you, you don't need anything else. You just need the correct connection and how the firing of those neurons elicit motor response. And the point is, and indeed, it's not needed. So explanatory speaking, and this is our point, it's like we can offer an explanation of how place cells causally guide the rat's behavior without assuming that anything like map using of map readings is taking place. This is the point of Stallman and Ray. This is the point of Gottfried Smith. So there is no explanatory gain, Packer Ramsey, in taking this a step further. So there is no explanatory gain in assuming that there is anything like a map consulting in any robust sense. But if we assume that this is the fact that makes them representation, there is no explanatory gain in assuming that they are representation. Okay, so this is the last bit.
I'll be very quick with this because we don't want to take up more time. And so really, the last is just these more radical reflections. To what extent our position is a limitivist and to what extent it's not. And I'll just very briefly. So obviously we want to retain the explanatory power. We're not denying the exciting properties that structural similarities will have or their explanatory value in neuroscience. We've given two reasons for thinking. One, we doubt that they have content in a robust sense required, and we similarly don't see that the analogy is strong enough to count them as representations in the sense that they don't have content. So those are our two steps to the argument. What does that leave us with? Well, of course, we're doubting, therefore, in one sense that we have content, but we also doubt that we need content to get targeted responses to the environment. So our account is not fully a limitivist account altogether. We would hang on to some notion of intentionality and directedness in a kind of a story, a more refined, we think, account from teleosemantics. modified so that it doesn't aim to try to give us those more robust accounts of content with intentional properties. Now, what does that mean in terms of limitedism? Well, we think this claim, which is connected with radical inactivism, is consistent with the claim that it's possible, even the claim recently made, it's possible to observe, using the techniques of experimental neuroscience, structural similarities that are doing causal work in cognition. However, if our analysis, philosophical analysis, is correct, doing so would not entail that you're observing contentful S representations doing causal work in cognition. So we think, of course, that these exist, but not the latter. Therein concludes our story. Thank you.
Thank you.